Okay, we move now to our second contributor to this new volume on risk reduction. Zhao Tong, thank you for joining us today. It's a pleasure to see you again. To get our conversation started, could you give our listeners a little bit of information about your background?
Sure. Thank you, Brad, for the opportunity to contribute to the work. I'm coming from a background in physics to the field of nuclear policy research. I was lucky to meet my former mentor, Professor Li Bin, when I was studying at Tsinghua University. I became really interested in the intersection of science, technology, and international security, arms control issues. After I getting my PhD from Georgia Tech, I have been working on nuclear policy issues, arms control, non-proliferation at Carnegie Tsinghua Center so far for 6 years already.
Great, thank you. And what brought you to your particular interest in this topic of nuclear risk reduction?
Well, personally, I do think there are serious nuclear risks. Firstly, there is a risk of nuclear arms control among the major powers. Recently, US officials basically threatened to spin China and Russia into oblivion through an all-out nuclear arms race. And in China, we have seen, aggressive opinion leaders like Hu Xijin calling for China to massively expand China's nuclear arsenal to more than 1,000 at least. Some senior Chinese experts also agree that there is a need to reflect on some of China's traditional nuclear policies. There is popular public support for China to invest more in nuclear arsenal. So both countries, in the case of US and China, they appear very confident about their capabilities to eventually outcompete the other, and they both perceive a high degree of hostility from the other side. So there is a risk there's real risk of a nuclear arms race, and there is a risk of unnecessary or inadvertent nuclear escalation if you consider the fact that some of the capabilities and postures of US and Chinese nuclear doctrine could create opportunities for misunderstanding during conflict. China has the new dual-capable missiles, DF-26, that can be armed with either a nuclear warhead or conventional warhead. So how could the United States accurately identify which one is which in a conflict where there is a lot of uncertainty and it's difficult to know things for sure. And today, China is still massively producing these dual-capable missiles, which means clearly the risk has now been fully understood. So that's also a concern. And both countries have serious misunderstanding about each other's nuclear policies that further contributes to nuclear risks. One example is, China basically sees the recent American re-emphasis on low-yield tactical nuclear weapons as a deliberate American plan to build up its nuclear warfighting capability to intentionally lower the threshold of nuclear use in a conventional conflict. So that types of mismatched understandings about each other's doctrines and policies also create risks. So these issues need to be addressed.
So, and in your essay in this volume, you've set out some ideas about what we can do together and separately to address these risks. Could you give us a brief overview of what those would be?
Yeah, sure. Basically, I think I try to make 3 points in my essay. I think there are, the 2 countries or the major powers can focus on what they can do based on three different timelines. One is for the long term. I do think there is a growing risk that the nuclear policy communities in the major powers are decoupling from each other. So they absorb different information, they live in their respective information bubbles, and they start to develop divergent views on factual issues, which means it's very hard for them to develop sane perspectives. That creates a lot of risk for misunderstanding and misinterpretation. They basically talk past each other. So, the so-called epistemic community of nuclear policy experts that have worked during the Cold War to help bring US and Soviet Union together to address some of the nuclear risks are today not working among the major powers. But that's a broader societal issue in terms of the decoupling of the societies under today's geopolitical environment. But I think something needs to be done to bring the nuclear policy communities together, making sure they can communicate frequently and regularly and substantively with each other to contain the misunderstandings as much as possible. And for the near term, if the major powers want to reduce nuclear risks, they need to agree on a few principal issues. For example, they need to agree that they share a common interest in pursuing cooperative security. And that understanding is not in existence today. Many times the big powers focus on competition, and they want to make sure they can win the competition, and in that process, the importance of addressing common nuclear risks are simply ignored. And countries are dominated by power politic thinking. So they haven't realized they need to pursue cooperative security. I think they need to set that common goal first, very clearly. And they also need to realize, transparency, things like that are very important if they want to make any progress. Secrecy or opacity obstructs efforts to contain arms race and efforts to manage crises. So you have to agree on principles on transparency as well. But a lot of work still needs to be done to achieve that. But one way to move things forward is for the top leaders in the major powers to talk about these principal issues first. That would be really helpful in a centralized political system like China. If the top leadership can endorse some basic principles of cooperative security or transparency, for example, that could really help move forward the domestic discussion on concrete risk reduction measures. In that regard, the P5 summit on international security issues that has been in discussion could be a very good way to kickstart the engagement at the very top government level. And in the midterm, I think the big powers really need to tackle substantive issues among themselves if they want to achieve nuclear risk reduction progress. One major barrier for countries like China and Russia to join arms control and address arms race is the concern about missile defense. That's a long-standing issue between them and the United States, but I think there are concrete and specific measures they can take to narrow their gap. And I'm going to publish a report on that, and therefore wouldn't delve too deeply into this now. And also, China, because of its traditional policy, it has a preference in terms of controlling nuclear risks. It wants to expand the no first use policy to more countries. And somehow we need to address that. We need to take that into consideration, and there are concrete ways that we can accommodate the preferences of countries like China. So those substantive policy issues need to be addressed in more depth, and hopefully my paper offers some useful thoughts.
He made reference to a new paper on missile defense. For listeners who are interested, where will they be able to find that when it's finished?
Oh, the missile defense report is going to be released by the end of June on Carnegie's website. But I also mentioned a couple of concrete ideas in our report and my essay.
Right. So your essay is very concrete and constructive. It also has a tone of cautious optimism to it. Where does that come from?
Well, I think we need to keep being optimistic for a few things. One is, despite the very crazy trajectory the big powers are currently on towards greater nuclear arms race, I think the decision makers in my country, in China, they are largely very rational strategists. So if we can help raise awareness of the various nuclear risks, if we can help them appreciate the nuclear risks, they would be interested in taking measures to address them. Such as the risks from new military technologies, hypersonic weapons, the risk of using cyber weapons against each other's nuclear command control systems. Those issues, I think, can be discussed, and there is already some level of interest at the government level in China to address those things. And there is clearly some interest in some quarters of Chinese military towards shifting China's nuclear posture towards launch on warning. That creates opportunity for having more in-depth discussion about the potential risks of doing that. And if we can make a good case that those risks, those postures involve more risks than benefits, I think there's a chance to help China make a better decision. China is ruled by rational decision makers. And I think the major powers, they all share common interests in avoiding very costly and dangerous nuclear arms race. The pandemic and the subsequent economic recession will put serious economic burden on all the major powers. They can no longer invest as heavily as before into their strategic capabilities. So if they have to do something, they have to limit or even cut, why couldn't they do it transparently and cooperatively in a process of which they can build mutual confidence? So there is some opportunity to discuss containing arms race. And all the major powers share interest in avoiding military incidents and in avoiding the military conflicts from inadvertently escalating to higher levels, including crossing the nuclear threshold. China in particular doesn't want to get involved in a serious military incident or to have military incidents to get out of control. So very interested in discussing those issues. And the rising US-China competition basically raises the importance of the views of third parties, the rest of the international community, European countries, etc. They now have a greater voice and greater influence to shape the behavior of the major powers, because both US and China, they now want to win broader support internationally in order to gain advantage in their bilateral great power competition. So the voice of the rest of the international community becomes more important. So they can demand responsible behavior, including efforts to address nuclear risks, to conduct nuclear risk reduction by the major powers. The rest of the international community can play an increasingly influential role in contributing to the process.
So thank you very much for this brief introduction, but very clear and very compelling review of the arguments in your essay. Let's wrap it up here, but let me give you the opportunity to say anything you might wish in closing.
Well, thank you, Brett, again, for the opportunity to contribute. I think now we face some good opportunities. The Trump administration is putting a lot of pressure on China to do arms control, but we can define arms control broadly. And here, risk reduction efforts can be a key part of arms control that involves China. It's the most realistic near-term measures to be supported by China. So it can be an early step of the broader arms control we are discussing. And many things need to be done and needs to be done urgently, including discussing, for example, whether the major powers should pursue dual-capable hypersonic weapons in the future. They should start a process of discussing these issues. And if awareness and appreciation of the risks can be raised, I think they would have a greater incentive to take both unilateral and cooperative measures to address them. And last point I want to make is maybe we want to pay more attention to nuclear risks at the regional level. So far, most of the discussion focuses on all-out nuclear exchanges or global scale nuclear conflict among the major powers. But in the case of US and China, the most likely scenario where a nuclear conflict might occur intentionally or inadvertently is over the territorial disputes over Taiwan Strait, some of the islands in South China Sea. That's where a serious conventional conflict can escalate to the nuclear level. And in those conflicts, it's not the strategic nuclear weapons that will get involved. It's those theater level nuclear forces. And China is modernizing many of those theater level nuclear weapons. And there is misunderstanding among the major powers about their nuclear doctrine at the theater level. In the case of China, the role of Chinese theater nuclear weapons is not very clear. And it's also at the theater level that nuclear conventional entanglement is most serious if you consider the DF-26 or DF-21 missiles. So that's where I think risk of nuclear conflict is most serious. So future discussions can focus on those regional level nuclear risk issues.
I'm completely with you on that. That's a big emerging problem set for us. Thank you so much for making the time to do this. Thank you for your excellent contribution to the volume. Thank you for joining us for the workshop. And we look forward to continued collaboration on topics of mutual interest. And at this point, we stand adjourned on this segment of our program.